You learned the Lord's Prayer as a child, memorized it word for word, but what if I told you that the prayer you know is incomplete? It's not a translation error, nor a historical coincidence. It is a deliberate removal. There is a verse present in very ancient manuscripts, predating the 1st century, that early Christians considered the most powerful part of the entire prayer. An invocation that awakened something within the human being, something the controllers of this reality did not want you to discover. The Gnostics called these controllers Archons, forces that shape your perception, feed on your fear, and keep your consciousness limited to a smaller version of itself. Jesus' original prayer above all functioned as a key to free oneself from these forces. In the next few minutes you will understand what was removed, why it was taken out, and how this hidden part can profoundly transform your spiritual life. But first, I need to show you something that will forever change the way you read this prayer. When I began studying Gnostic texts, this initial discovery led me to create awakened minds. I realized that something was fundamentally wrong with what we were taught. I did not expect to find what I found. I thought the differences between manuscripts were merely minor adjustments, translation errors. But they were not. They were gaps, surgically removed. The story of the Lord's Prayer begins long before the institutional church we know today. Jesus originally delivered this prayer in Aramaic around the year 30 AD, in a cultural and spiritual context completely different from what would later become Christian tradition. This prayer was not initially written down. It was passed orally from disciple to disciple for decades, in a process involving memory, interpretation, and communal teaching. During these years of oral transmission, each repetition, explanation, and reflection helped shape the prayer in ways often not captured in later written records. The oldest record we have is found in the Gospel of Matthew, dated between 80 and 90 AD, about 50 years after Jesus' death. This means that half a century passed between the moment Jesus spoke his words and the moment they were formally recorded. A whole 50 years of oral transmission, interpretation, selection, and filtering. During this time, each local Christian community may have adapted nuances, emphasized certain aspects, and possibly omitted others, either through their own understanding or under the influence of regional and cultural traditions. It is important to consider the historical context of this period. 1st century Palestine was under Roman rule, marked by political, cultural, and religious tensions. Christian communities emerged among different Jewish groups, each with its own traditions and messianic expectations. The Lord's Prayer, then, was not only a spiritual practice, it was also a revolutionary teaching, a way to connect each individual directly to the divine, without relying on temples, priests, or complex rituals. This aspect of the prayer, direct connection with God, made it, even in the early years, a powerful tool for inner transformation and spiritual resistance against forces controlling human perception. During this period of oral transmission, it is possible that many elements we now consider essential were adjusted or even removed. Research into ancient Gnostic texts, such as those found in Nag Hammadi, suggest that there were components of the prayer early Christians considered extremely powerful, but which disappeared from the official versions that reached us. These additional elements were not merely poetic or symbolic words. They were specific invocations intended to activate inner consciousness, to awaken the divine spark each human carries within. The passage of time, fear of persecution, and the need to consolidate a coherent tradition also influenced how the prayer was recorded. The versions that reached us, such as Matthew's, reflect not only Jesus' words, but also choices made by those documenting these traditions. Each decision, what to include, what to omit, what to emphasize, had profound consequences for how future generations would understand and practice the prayer. Furthermore, we must consider the differences between the versions found in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Structurally, they are not identical. Luke, for example, does not include the final doxology, that widely known phrase, "For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever." This absence raises deep questions. If Jesus taught the prayer in a specific form, why did two evangelists record different versions? Some scholars suggest the differences are due to the distinct contexts and specific audiences of each evangelist. However, evidence indicates the explanation is more complex, involving conscious decisions about what should remain in official traditions and what should be omitted. possibly for reasons of institutional control or doctrinal interpretation. The Nag Hammadi manuscripts discovered in Egypt in 1945 shed fascinating light on these issues. Among the texts are 52 Gnostic documents, many likely buried by monks who understood the deep spiritual value of the content and wanted to protect it from alteration or destruction. These texts reveal that early Christian tradition was much richer and deeper than what survived the filter of the institutional church. Among the differences is the understanding of Jesus' prayer not as mere supplication, but as spiritual activation, a practice aimed at realigning the inner divine spark with the original source of light. Syrian Gnostics of the 1st century, for example, practiced a form of prayer called prayer of dissolution, or in some texts, the key of the pleroma. The pleroma represents divine fullness, the original reality of light before any fragmentation or limitation. In this context, the prayer was not a request to a distant God, but a spiritual technology that allowed the practitioner to recognize and affirm their own divine nature. This approach completely transforms the understanding of the Lord's Prayer, turning it from a devotional text into a method of conscious reconnection with the origin of one's soul. The internal cosmology presented in Gnostic texts changes the meaning of phrases like, "Thy kingdom come." Rather than a request, it becomes an affirmation. The kingdom is within us. The kingdom is the inner reality we can recognize and access. This understanding implies that the prayer has a direct effect on consciousness, capable of dissolving patterns of fear, anxiety, and limitation imposed by the Archons, entities identified by the Gnostics as forces controlling the lower layers of existence. Modern research, in a way, corroborates these practices. Neuroscientific studies show that intentional prayer, performed mindfully and affirming one's own divinity, activates specific brain areas, increases coherence between hemispheres, and reduces activity associated with fear. This effect is exactly what the Gnostics sought through their invocations, confirming that prayer is not merely symbolic, but also an instrument of neuro-spiritual transformation. When considering the Lord's Prayer in its historical, cultural, and Gnostic context, we realize that the official record we know is only part of what Jesus taught. Oral transmission, word selection, cultural and institutional filters over 50 years, and later the centuries of church consolidation, resulted in a reduced version, preserving the essence of devotion, but losing the transformative depth the prayer originally held. To understand the true potential of the prayer, it is necessary to recover the lost dimension: active consciousness, affirmation of inner light, reconnection with the inner divine. This perspective allows us to see the Lord's Prayer not merely as a traditional religious practice, but as a powerful spiritual tool, capable of awakening dormant consciousness, dissolving fear, and activating the divine spark present in each of us. The story of the Lord's Prayer, therefore, is not just the story of a prayer. It is the story of how human spirituality was transmitted, shaped, filtered, and, in many ways, restricted. It is also the story of how we can reclaim what was taken from us, the direct, personal, transformative experience of the divine. Every word, pause, and conscious affirmation is a return to Jesus' original intentions, allowing the prayer to fulfill its deepest purpose, awakening the human being to the fullness of the light already dwelling within. And here arises the first problem. The versions of Matthew and Luke are different, not slightly but structurally. Luke does not even include the final doxology, "For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever," which everyone knows. Why? If Jesus taught the prayer this way, why did two evangelists record different versions? The official explanation says they were different audiences, but the Nag Hammadi manuscripts discovered in Egypt in 1945 reveal another reality impossible to ignore. Early Christian tradition was far richer and far more threatening to institutional power than what survived the church's filter. Among these differences, early Christians saw Jesus' prayer not as supplication, but as activation. If the Lord's Prayer you know is not the complete version, then what is it? Syrian Gnostics of the 1st century already practiced it as the prayer of dissolution, or, in some texts, the key of the pleroma, the divine fullness where light exists before any fragmentation. Today, scholars like Elaine, Pagels, and Marvin Meyer call this the cosmological context of Jesus' prayer, a system in which praying was not asking a distant God, but realigning the inner divine spark with the source. I call it conscious reconnection prayer. The principle is simple. Jesus did not teach submission. He taught a spiritual technology of resistance. Resistance to what? To the Archons, entities governing layers of material existence, not necessarily physical beings, but patterns of consciousness, control structures, archetypes of fear, keeping the human identified only with the material world and unconscious of their own divinity. Think with me. You wake up in the morning with unreasoned anxiety, that weight on your chest, that inner voice saying you are not enough, that the world is dangerous, that you must fear and obey. Where does this come from? The Gnostics had a clear answer, and Jesus taught a practice to silence that voice. Early Christians documented this practice as a layered process: breath, intention, specific invocation, and finally, an affirmation that later versions simply do not contain. This is not theory. Egyptian papyri, fragments of the Didache and the Gospel of the Egyptians, preserve variations of the prayer not found in Matthew or Luke. The Gospel of Thomas, found in Nag Hammadi, records sayings of Jesus that completely change the interpretation of the prayer. In saying 3, Jesus says, "The kingdom is within you and outside you." It is not a request, it is a statement of reality. In 1945, Muhammad Ali al-Saman found 13 codices in Nag Hammadi, with texts over 1,600 years old, including the Secret Book of John and the Gospel of Truth. All reveal the Gnostic cosmology of the Archons, forces that trap the soul in material bodies so it does not recognize its divine origin. Among these practices is the invocation of the true name of light, not symbolic, but a sound pattern resonating with the frequency of the pleroma. 3rd century Coptic fragments and the Bruce Papyrus include a line after the doxology, "And I recognize in myself what cannot be imprisoned, the light that precedes creation." A declaration, not a request. According to the Gnostics, this phrase awakened something in the human that the Archons could not touch. Modern research confirms something similar. A 2015 study at the University of Florence showed that intentional prayer, affirming divine identity, activates the prefrontal cortex, increases brain coherence, and reduces amygdala activity by 34%. Exactly what the Gnostics called archonic dissolution. After the Council of Nicaea, 325 AD, this verse disappears from all official versions. Why? Christianity became institutional. Controlling people's spirituality began to generate authority and power. If everyone recognized the inner light, monad, there would be no need for intermediaries, pope, bishop, or indulgence. Now, you can restore part of this practice with 3 simple steps. Layered recitation. Before praying, take 3 deep breaths, exhaling more than inhaling. Then recite each verse slowly, reflecting on the internal meaning of each word. Affirmation of the lost verse. There is a subtle practice that many overlook when reading or reciting ancient doxologies, yet it has the power to transform the spiritual experience. After completing the doxology, silently add to yourself the phrase, "And I recognize in myself what cannot be imprisoned, the light that precedes all form." This seemingly simple addition holds a depth that transcends words. It is not merely a comment or a mental reflection. It is a conscious invocation of an inner reality that remains beyond the boundaries of the physical and mental. By reciting this, the prayer ceases to be merely an act of supplication, a request directed outward, and becomes a profound reconnection with one's inner essence. It is a reminder that within us exists something that cannot be limited, shaped, or confined by the contours of daily life, social expectations, or internal judgments. The light that precedes all form is our primordial spark, the core of consciousness that precedes any thought, any concept, and any external experience. When we recognize this, the prayer becomes a bridge between the human and the divine, between the conscious and what lies beyond ordinary consciousness. This practice may seem subtle, almost imperceptible, but its effectiveness does not lie in the grandeur or ostentation of the words, but in the attention given to the present moment, to the awareness of that which cannot be contained. By including this affirmation, something shifts internally. The supplication ceases to be a unilateral gesture, and attention turns to the presence of a light already dwelling within us, a force that is both ours and infinite, preceding any limitation or concept we can imagine. By recognizing this light, we begin to perceive that the state of prayer and reconnection does not depend on the outside. It is not conditioned on signs, confirmations, or responses arriving from external sources. It is, in essence, a return to that which always was and always will be. And by practicing this silent insertion at the end of our doxologies, we are in fact aligning ourselves with something primordial, timeless, and universal. Beyond this direct practice, there is also a path of study that deepens this reconnection, a path requiring careful attention and an open mind. The primitive texts, especially those found in Nag Hammadi, offer a unique panorama of consciousness and spiritual experience. Among these texts, the Secret Book of John and the Gospel of Truth stand out, both rich in images, symbols, and instructions that go far beyond mere religious narrative. When approaching them, it is essential not to see them as simple metaphors or moral parables. They function as consciousness technologies, tools that help the reader navigate between levels of the mind, perceive internal structures of reality, and recognize the presence of light that transcends all form. Each word, each concept, each symbolic nuance carries the potential to awaken, generate insight, alter perception, and reconnect with that which is eternal. The Secret Book of John, for example, offers a vision of the cosmos, creation, and human consciousness that differs radically from conventional interpretations. It describes the origin of the world from levels of consciousness, from the purest and most unlimited to the densest and most manifested. Creation, according to this text, is not merely an external event, but a sequence of emanations of primordial light, a process that also reflects in each individual. By reading and meditating on these passages, we can perceive our own spiritual journey as a reflection of these emanations, a path of return to the source. It is not about logically understanding every concept or fitting each detail into a theological system, but about allowing consciousness to expand, subtle perceptions to awaken, and the very experience of being to rise to broader levels of awareness. Similarly, the Gospel of Truth offers instructions that, when contemplated deeply, function as keys of perception. It emphasizes the idea that truth is not something external to be obtained or conquered, but a presence residing within us, a light that is simultaneously interior and universal. This gospel presents the experience of reconnection not as an intellectual effort or rigid discipline, but as a progressive awakening to that which has always existed. Each insight that arises during reading or meditation on the text is, in reality, a reflection of the light that precedes all form, the same light that can be silently recognized after the doxology. The practice of contemplating these words becomes a bridge between ordinary mind and primordial consciousness, between daily routine and the experience of the eternal. By integrating these practices, the silent insertion of the affirmation of the lost verse and the direct study of the primitive texts, a circle of reconnection is created that is both introspective and expansive. On one hand, there is a return to one's own essence, the recognition of the light that cannot be imprisoned. On the other, there is an expansion of consciousness through the exploration of ancient texts, which function as maps of perception and technologies of self-discovery. The combined effect is profound. The prayer ceases to be an attempt to influence the outside and becomes an act of internal alignment. And the study is not merely intellectual but experiential, transforming the mind and heart toward a greater consciousness. It is important to note that these practices require delicacy, patience, and discernment. It is not about accumulating knowledge or repeating phrases mechanically, but about allowing each word, each reading, and each silent recognition to become a living experience. The affirmation after the doxology, though brief, opens space for consciousness to expand naturally. Similarly, the study of the Nag Hammadi texts should be done mindfully, allowing images, concepts, and symbols to resonate internally, creating insights that cannot be forced but arise spontaneously. Each step of this path strengthens the awareness that there is something within us that does not depend on external circumstances, that cannot be limited or contained. That is the very primordial light. Furthermore, these practices offer a way to integrate spirituality and daily life. When we recognize the light that precedes all form, not only during prayer but also in ordinary moments, we begin to perceive the presence of the divine in all situations. Each experience, pleasurable or challenging, can become a point of contact with this primordial consciousness, and by combining this perception with the teachings of the primitive texts, we learn to navigate life with greater clarity, discernment, and serenity. The light is not a distant or abstract concept. It is a reality permeating every aspect of our existence, guiding us beyond the limitations of mind and matter. Finally, the continuous practice of this process, silent affirmation after the doxology and conscious study of the primitive texts, cultivates a deeper perception of what it means to be human. We discover that true spirituality does not depend on external approval, rigid rituals, or limited beliefs, but on direct recognition of the light that cannot be imprisoned. This light reminds us that the essence of our existence is infinite, immutable, and sacred, and that each moment of conscious attention, each deep reflection, and each silent acknowledgement contributes to the awakening of this consciousness. Over time, the practice transforms not only perception but also the experience of life, allowing each action, thought, and emotion to be lived with greater depth, authenticity, and connection to the primordial light. Common mistakes: attempting the affirmation without preparing the physiological state, breathing. Expecting immediate results. The practice consolidates over time. With consistency, you will perceive the prayer as an internal dialogue, not merely mechanical words. The experience of reconnection appears not only in prayer but in everyday moments. Today you discovered that the Lord's Prayer is not incomplete by accident. You have seen evidence, studies, and manuscripts showing a forgotten dimension of spiritual power. Now the choice is yours. Continue with the reduced version or practice the complete prayer, reclaiming the connection that 1,700 years of institutionalization tried to hide.